Hey everyone, this is Derrick Broze of the Conscious Resistance Network, and today we're bringing you another important interview from a new guest on our channel that many of you have requested I speak with, so I'm very thankful to speak with Dr. Shiva Ayyadurai. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yep, you can just call me Dr. Shiva after that.
Dr. Shiva, all right, well that's great. We're going to skip most of the pleasantries because both of us have busy schedules. I think anybody interested in your credentials, we'll put those in the video description below, and those are widely available. We're just going to get right into the topics that we want to cover today, of course, discussing your recent discussions around COVID-19, the failures of the World Health Organization, the failures of the CDC and others. Let's start with this. I watched your video this morning on Twitter today. We're recording this on Tuesday, April 7th, and you were discussing a lot of different concepts. The one thing I want to start with, which I think is a bit more solutions-based, is this idea of decentralizing science. Can you give us a little bit more information on that and what you mean by that?
Yeah, look, the history of science, if you look back at it, you know, the greatest innovations, science and innovation very closely tied, always came from the edges. Be it, you know, we don't know who created the wheel, right? Innovation is in people's DNA. You know, when I created the first email system, it was done before I came to MIT in a small medical college, and that's what irks those people in power, because it goes against this narrative that you have to be anointed after you go to, you know, one of the centers of quote unquote of the military industrial complex, or the kid who invented TV, Philo Farnsworth. They did it on a small farm. In fact, if you look before sort of around the 40s, there was a incentive. People would have these competitions, right? And people all over the world would try to solve some problem. And somewhere along the way, around after World War II, with Sputnik and the Manhattan Project, all of this got centralized. And it created an incredible opportunity for a few set of people to control science. And science became highly politicized. And the milestone, the critical point of that was the Mansfield Amendment of 1970, where you literally pulled away a lot of research dollars, which was for basic science that was sent everywhere, under the political organizations of the NIH and the NSF. And these are things many Americans are not aware of, but what you saw was a consolidation of science and innovation. Eisenhower talked to this around, you know, when he gave his farewell address in 1961. He talked about what it would mean to democracy if you had small sets of people really controlling the narratives of science and innovation.
Yeah, and this is, of course, you kind of mentioned this as well, the military-industrial complex and the various complexes that connect to that. And there are, I'm sure, plenty of people who aren't aware that that also infects and affects the scientific fields. So I really appreciate that you brought that to the table, because here on our channel, we definitely try to talk about solutions to everything that we're facing in our world today. And you're obviously very aware that there are powerful people who are trying to influence and manipulate the world, including with this current crisis, this pandemic and a panic, as some are calling it. I want to get your opinion on a few different topics related to this, because as I'm sure you're seeing, there are a number of theories floating around the internet, including, you know, the mainstream theories, the theories coming from the CDC, from the World Health Organization, and then others trying to make all sorts of insinuations and claims. And as I mentioned earlier, I did take a poll with some of my listeners and ask them what they would like to hear from you. And a few of the things that popped up, one of them particularly, are your thoughts on the type of test that is being used for COVID-19, the RT-PCR test, and the potential for false positives, the potential for it to greatly exaggerate the amount of people who have what they're calling COVID-19. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there, you know, ultimately the best way, if you want, first of all, let's just step back. You know, you have a lot of viruses in you right now, about 380 trillion, and there's a ton of viruses around you. Everyone gets viruses. When people say we're going to stop you from getting the virus, right, you're going to get a virus. And what happens is, in your body's natural course, it fires off a whole choreography of chemical reactions to modulate that pathogen, and that's why we exist. And it modulates that. You know, in the simple case, you may have some sniffles, you may have some cough, right? Your body's going through what's called the innate immune process, and it generates its antibodies, your microbiome readjusts, and, you know, you're still alive and you're moving forward. In the case of somebody who has a, you know, a compromised or a dysfunctional immune system, that's when you have the body vehemently overreacting, and it starts eating away its own body. So it's our bodies that attack ourselves, caused by this quote unquote allergen, right? That comes in, but it's our bodies attacking us. So when people are trying to detect a virus, the number one way to do it is you look for the antibody, okay? What they're doing, and maybe they can't find the antibody, or maybe it takes a long time to find it, okay? Maybe the disease process. So there's a theory they call slow viruses. That's the theory that they moved to, because see, what's happened in science is they want to always create a nail, and everything else always has a hammer, okay? One hammer. In this case, it's everything is an infectious disease, right? You create the boogeyman on everything. So I just want to give you sort of the larger piece of where science has moved to with the HIV nonsense, creating AIDS, be it Legionnaire's disease, and you can go back even a couple hundred years ago, as I talked about, right? Scurvy and pellagra and all this were always some infectious virus and bacteria, when it turned out it was vitamin C deficiency, thiamine deficiency, niacin deficiency. So they don't want to talk about that because you don't need $12 billion to figure that out, okay? Or whatever, $20 billion. So we need to understand this in the political context. So the ability to detect a virus, what they're doing is they're looking for a piece, through a polymerase chain reaction, PCR, of a section of the nucleotides. Now, that section could come from elsewhere, okay? It doesn't have to be from the whole nucleotide. Ultimately, it's the antibody test, is what really tells you if you've got the virus or not. And probably, I bet you a lot of us have already gotten it. So the denominator on this is much bigger than we know. But that test that they're doing can elicit a lot of false positives because of the fact that you're looking for a little fragment. And we don't know if that fragment could come from other things in our body, right? Or other viruses. So it's all, frankly, in many ways, a medieval way that they're doing all of this, from how we're recording who had COVID, right? The World Health Organization has created 2 codes. One is you actually have tested positive. By the way, the WHO creates the codes for diagnosis that every hospital uses. And another one's a very, very, very fuzzy code. Well, it sort of smells like COVID. Do they have chest pain, et cetera? So you have people who have all these pre-existing conditions who probably are in awful shape. They probably, during flu season, they're always going to the hospital. I know people like this. And now they go in and they branded COVID. And if they die from it, it's going to be they died from COVID. Forget about the fact that they smoked for 30 years. We're probably 50, 60, 100, 200, 300 pounds overweight. That will all be forgotten. It'll just be COVID. And so when it comes to the testing of this, we have to understand that unless you actually have the antibody, coming up, that you don't even know what they've really got. A lot of these tests have a lot of false positives.
Yeah, you're 100% right about that. And I appreciate you making mention and bringing to the conversation the underlying conditions that can contribute to people being sick.
And no one wants to talk about that. That's always like a subtext. And now, after I've been hitting it hard, some of the newspapers are talking about this, but it's always like over here. Oh, by the way, they had blah, 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 right? It's not like, wait a minute, 90% of these people who have the critical care fatal reaction are elderly. Their immune system is compromised. Thyroid levels, HCl levels go down. You don't want to talk about that. They're immunocompromised people, or they have pre-existing conditions, CVID, or they had AIDS, or they were taking monoclonal antibodies. I mean, you go down the list, smokers, diabetics, et cetera. So we're not, what we really need to see is how many of those people have these pre-existing conditions. That should be front and center in every news article, but that isn't, because now you have to talk about immune health. And then when you have to talk about immune health, you'll find who the real problem with immune health is. It is a big ag and big pharma and an entire lifestyle and dirty air, dirty water, and dirty food, which has caused that. We don't want to talk about that, because that means you start putting the mirror at these politicians and lawyers, lobbyists, and big pharma and big ag. So you put it on this little poor virus. So it's always a little virus, right? It's easy to attack this little virus. I'm not saying viruses don't cause, that people should not be concerned. We shouldn't wash our hands. These are all very good hygiene things anyway. But directing the entire narrative of a small set of people who are immunocompromised to point fearmonger on this virus is the ultimate of propaganda. It's fascism what's taking place, because it's fascism because you're using this big top-down institutionalized science, which has a narrow view of the biological sciences, where vaccines and pharma are the only interventions. And you move the discourse away from immune health, which is what can help many, many people, over to this issue of, this virus and this very, very narrow model of 6,000, 7,000 people who've died now, right? So that's the name of the game. And people need to wake up. A guy like Fauci and the entire National Institute of Health was built on the model of branding everything an infectious disease. That's their entire, call to action. Everything's an infectious disease because now you scare people. Now you get a lot of funding because then we as taxpayers say, oh yeah, let's fund the NIH because they're going to solve AIDS. They're going to solve, Legionnaire's disease. They're going to, et cetera.
So while we're talking about the nature of the virus, this is another question I think you might have something to add to the conversation, because again, there's so many streams of thought. People are at home, they're quarantined at home, they're trying to figure out what's going on. Many people, as you and I, do not trust the mainstream sources, and so they're looking for alternative sources of information. Unfortunately, there's a lot of bad information out there as well. And one thing I see popping up that sort of relates to what we were just on is this idea that the germ theory itself is not factual. And there are people who are talking about terrain theory and trying to bring that back into the conversation. Do you have anything to say on that, of this idea versus germ theory versus terrain theory, and whether or not, obviously you just said viruses are real, people should wash their hands, things of that sort, but what do you think about that part of the conversation?
Look, the reality is, let's start with some principles that everyone can agree to, and bound the conversation, because then we can try to come to truth here, okay? We do know everyone's body chemistries are very different, okay? Your body is different than my body. Well, how's that different? Well, genetic differences, epigenetic differences, what you eat, where you live, how much sleep you get, all these things can turn off and turn off genes. So each one of us is very unique. Well, one of the central operating systems of our body is the immune system. We have this amazing microbiome, right? All this bacteria in our gut, around 60 trillion bacteria, 380 trillion viruses. We also know that gut system interacts directly with our brain. Okay, the gut-brain axis. So what goes on here affects our brain. And then you have the interferon system, the innate system, the adaptive system. All these are very interesting. It's an ecosystem of complexity. So what we do know is we're all unique beings, okay? What you need for your immune health could be very different than what I need for my immune health. Some people can withstand, living in slums and they don't get anything. When I was a kid, I used to go back and forth to India. The first week I went, I'd always get diarrhea and then I'd be fine, right? My body was adjusting to that new microbes. So the locals there literally drink out of the quote unquote unhygienic water, right? Because their bodies have developed the resistance and they've been immunized to handle that environment. So what we need to understand is that we are not like these little bubbles independent of the environment. We're part of the environment. When you look at an aquarium, it's the fish in the water, and they're not separate. They're all one, right? So we live in a pool of microbes. We live in a pool of bacteria, whatever you want to call them, right? We live in a pool. I mean, people have talked about things, precursors to bacteria and these microbes. Well, we live in a pool of them. We are them, okay? We're an extension of them. We only have 6 trillion cells. We have 60 trillion bacteria, as I said, 380. So who are we? You could argue, are we cells or are we bacteria? We ourselves have 380 trillion viruses in us. So my point is that the perceptual difference that needs to take place is we are part of this very complex ecosystem, which we are only starting to understand. We just found out that we have 20,000 genes, the same number of genes as a worm. Okay, that was a big revolution in biology in 2003. Now we found out that we haven't mapped 98% of the genome. And in fact, the latest very interesting lecture that Gerald Fink gave at MIT is that the other 98% of our DNA is actually genes, but not genes that code for protein, genes that code for RNA, which control the protein encoding capabilities of the other 20,000 genes. So what I'm saying is we know so little. We know very, very little. It's like looking out into the stars. We haven't even explored. I mean, we know nothing, right? But we do know that there's a vast amount of biology we don't know. We do live in a sea of microbes and viruses, and we survive. There's 7.2 billion of us, okay? We're not all dying. All the people in Wuhan didn't die. Even if you look beyond, let's say, the Spanish flu epidemic, of the many other epidemics, maximum people that it infected was 15%, maximum in a population. So if this even doubles, it'll infect 90 million people in the United States. And let's even double the mortality rate from 0.3% to 0.6, 540,000 people will die. I'm just saying we need to put all of this in context. That's the same number of people who die from heart disease and cancer. So my point is that the entire basis of always trying to point a finger at a virus, right, or a bacterium, which is what medicine has always done, doesn't seem to be working. What does work is, what do we do to build resilience? That's what I want to focus on. How do you build resilience? These are things that we can control. And resilience comes from understanding your body is a system. Two, what are the right inputs that it needs? You know, if you're an Olympic athlete, you're going to need a lot more nutrients, a lot more, support than if you're sort of, sitting under a tree and just meditating. You probably can live on a blade of grass, okay? So this is a larger piece we need to understand. We live in a sea of microbes, or if you don't want to call them microbes, all other theories we can create, but we are part of something much, much larger. And we're a component of that. So the issue is, what can we do to support, our physical immune system? Because I think the immune system is the OS of our entire body.
Got you. And just to clarify, so, I mean, would you say that there's no reason to look back towards terrain theory? Obviously, taking into consideration everybody's bodies are different, epigenetics and what you just mentioned, but do you think where we're at, obviously things aren't working completely, but germ theory versus terrain theory, very specifically on that, do you think there's merit to exploring the terrain theory any further?
Yeah, look, I think science should always be exploring, Science should always go through the rigorous scientific method, always and all the time. The scientific method goes, you have a guess, terrain theory, germ theory, right? Germ theory resulted in Koch's postulates, right? In order to prove that a germ is infected and you cause something, Koch had a very specific set of things. And by the way, many of these things, HIV causing AIDS, don't fulfill it. So, and some do, but the vast majority of things in human history where they always pointed at a virus didn't fulfill it. As you know, Koch's postulates are that you have to find a large amount, an abundance, not one little, now with all this instrument, you can find one little virus and you can say, oh, that caused it, right? It's nonsense. His postulates were you have to find abundance of that virus. If you want to claim this causes, then you have to be able to isolate that. Then you have to be able to show that if you put that in another creature, it causes the exact same, thing that was in the original, and then you should be able to re-isolate it back. Many of these claims where they've tried to blame a virus has not been able to even prove Koch's postulates. So we do know if you want to prove this germ caused this, you can go through a rigor. Now with terrain, the terrain hypothesis model, I think people should apply the same rigor. Let's apply the scientific method. Let's take a guess. Let's apply it. Let's see if we can duplicate the results and apply it again. And then let people share that knowledge with everyone. I'm not saying peer-reviewed journals, but let people actually, the good thing is if you should be able to prove this stuff.
Awesome. Well, I want to go back to one thing you mentioned a moment ago. I know we're short on time, so we'll start to wind down. But you mentioned vitamin C deficiency. I'm curious if you've seen the work of Dr. Chang and some others from China and in general regarding intravenous high-dose vitamin C and the positive benefits of that with treating.
Yeah, there's one of my colleagues that I work with. Let me see if he's here. Michael Guzman. He just sent me. There's a whole series of papers that have come out. Linus Pauling, was really the father of orthomolecular medicine. What Pauling believed was that all disease was from some nutrient deficiency. Okay, and the goal was for you to find out what your nutrition deficiency was versus me, and you modulate those and you solve disease. And I tend to believe this more and more and more and more. And I created a technology called Cytosolve, which helps us understand this. But if you look at the preponderance of work, from Wang to Fowler, you go over and over, high dose vitamin C and influenza. This came out in 2019, intravenous vitamin C and infectious mononucleosis, a case report. There's been so much work done on vitamin C. A vast body of literature, particularly IV, when people are in critical care. That's why in the letter I wrote to President Trump, I said for people in critical care, you give 100 grams IV, over a day. This is not even, this is not even like gee whiz. This has been done over and over and over again. What's unfortunate is you have a guy like Fauci get up on that stage and he doesn't even talk about that. He doesn't even talk about giving that to people. Then the sister to vitamin C is glutathione, which is one of the most powerful antioxidants. As you age, glutathione levels drop, right? Elderly people have less. When you're young, you have a lot of it. So even though you may not be eating well, that's why a lot of the younger people do not get this, because you have the antioxidants to support you. I'm going to be doing a talk about this later this week. But the fundamentals is that vitamin C is extremely necessary. You know, you don't get enough, you get scurvy on one extreme. And then on the other extreme, it modulates so many immune reactions in our body. But particularly, the use has been when people are in critical conditions, right? When you're stressed, you know, when the body's disturbed, that's when vitamin C seems to have the most profound effects, which is what people are when they're in critical care.
So this is more of a personal question, I guess, to you. This is sent to me by one of my viewers who is looking at everything. They've been following your content. For example, this morning you talked about Bill Gates and the amount of money he puts into the World Health Organization, obviously Fauci, and these various players that do not seem to genuinely have the best interest at heart of the average person. And I think when you start to dig deeper into this whole picture, it becomes clear that they do not have our best interest at heart. So the question is, Dr. Shiva, if Gates and others are pushing a vaccine for COVID-19, where we've just discussed alternative treatments and alternative ways to go about this, and something becomes mandatory or even maybe softly coerced, like you can't go to work, you can't travel until you've proven this. Gates has talked about immunity, digital certificates and immunity passports and things of this sort. From your personal standpoint, you know, how would you handle that? And what other advice would you offer to folks who are very concerned about that potential reality?
Well, look, I think it's a great question. I think this entire coronavirus discourse, if you just go back 6 months before this, and you can even go back longer, what was occurring in the world? Massive dissension against the establishment was taking place, right? You had huge protests in Hong Kong, okay? Whether you agree with them or not. In Wuhan itself, there were massive protests, anti-pollution protests 6 months before. You had protests in Venezuela. People have forgotten about all of this because of social media. We had protests all over France. We had protests in Italy, anti-vaccine protests. We had protests in this country, one of them which I led in New Jersey, which won a major victory because the legislature was so afraid of the militant protests they did not even bother to review the bill, okay? So you had this massive dissension taking place. And those in power do not want dissension. They do not want people self-organizing bottoms up. So what you see that they've really done is they've created tremendous amount of fear to suppress this dissension, right? And it's done that. No one even remembers. We don't know how many people probably got killed in China for protesting, and this was used as a vehicle, as a cover-up, right? Some of those people, if you saw in some of those videos, looked pretty healthy. They were just looking like they were getting beaten because they were dissenting. And Wuhan has been a history of protests there. Now, add to that the fact that, you know, Trump's victory, whether you like Trump or not, he was a disruptor. You know, he wasn't a Republican or Democrat per se. He definitely was a thorn in the side of both parties. And so his big claim was the economy, right? Well, that's being trashed. 10 million people applied for unemployment just in March of 2020. So that's been taken care of, right? And the third thing you have is mandated medicine. So we stand at this very interesting point that it really comes down to, are we going to be, you know, I'm finishing up a book called The Climate of Science. You know, it was done. I was adding one more chapter, which I got to finish. But what I talk about is we're literally at this very interesting juncture. Are we going to go into the golden age where human beings become human? Or are we going to go into the dark ages? And a very famous anthropologist did some very interesting research. He said in the first 20 years of any century is when it's decided whether you go into the dark ages or the golden age. And we're right there. And this decision on, do we as people accept the state imposing their will on us in such a way that it denies our existence as what it means to be a human being? Because once you control the bloodstream, top down, what goes into your mouth, how you move, you basically have a robot. Everyone talks about AI. AI started when we created the manufacturing line and you put human beings on it to do this work, right? We already had AI. Now we're sort of, those in power are trying to tweak that AI, right? You want to make it, well, they probably made a decision. Do we want silicon-based beings where we have to build? That may even be more expensive. Why don't we have carbon-based beings which we can control, like an airplane, right? And that's where this is about. Okay, let me keep my carbon-based creatures. They may be cheaper, okay? Versus creating silicon-based creatures. And I'm going to make sure that I can control their movements. China has already done this to their people. They have 200 million cameras all over China. They watch where people go. They have a social, what is it? The social something score, right?
Social credit score, yeah.
Social credit score, and you can't travel. Think about what that means. A small set of people, the Chinese Communist Party, controlling its top-down control. And now with the technology we have in data analytics, predictive analytics, control systems theory, you can actually control billions of people through centralized computing. You can easily do that. So that's what this is about. Now, in order to do that, you have to make the little units on this network fall in line. Well, one way is fear. And what an amazing opportunity for them, the 0.001% or 0.001%, to control the vast majority of, because with fear, you'll have people saying, yeah, it's okay. Yeah, you're right. I should get a digital certificate. Yeah, I should not be allowed to go to the gym unless I have my thumb scanned, whatever that is, right? Yes, I should not be allowed to drive. And also you too, okay? You should also not be allowed to do that. Do you want to crash the economy? That's what they're going to ask you, right? Do you want to hurt my children? That's the mode that they've set up. And that's why I think the key thing for people to understand is all of that dialogue and that narrative is based on this one singular assumption of what the immune system is, right? So, and that knowledge is typically hidden for most people. Most people don't think about this. Most people believe the big pharma MD education model. Most medical doctors are victims. They don't even understand how vitamin D works. Ask them what cathelicidins are. They can't explain it. Ask them what cytokeratin is. They can't explain it because they haven't learned that. So you have egomaniacal MD educational system. I say the educational system, which creates people who don't understand nutrition or the body's system, and you unleash them on people and you make them be the literal experts. So now you have a bunch of people following those experts. But I think we have a big opportunity, because the big opportunity I see is most of the world, at least more than 50% of it, are people still work with their hands, still work for a living, still create, run businesses. And people like myself and you and others listening, I think ultimately we have a lot of common sense, and they're banking on the non-common sense people, which are the educated, vulnerable elites. The people get their degrees when they learn nothing, they don't have a skill, they can't really write a piece of software, nor they can fix a washer. They can't fix anything. Everything is top-down, just dictated knowledge. That's where they're banking this on.
Well, I really appreciate that explanation. I know your time is probably ready to go now for your next interview.
So, thank you. Thank you for your time. I thank you and your audience.
Absolutely. I'll put your links below for everybody who wants to check out his work. And I just want to suggest to you, Dr. Shiva, and anybody else who's listening, maybe tuning in for the first time, I actually just released a book about a month ago called How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State before this whole thing started going on.
Oh, very cool.
Detailing how we can go forward surviving this situation. And I absolutely believe what you said, that we have the potential right now. We're at a very important moment to change the direction of humanity's history. And it's going to take a lot of difficult work, but I believe it's possible. And I'm thankful for people like yourself who are sharing information out there and making sure that people can consider these ideas. So thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, and I think people should know, I'm running for Senate in Massachusetts, which I'm sure you put down Shiva for Senate, but it's not just running for Senate office. It's about being a humble catalyst to create a broad movement where people understand the interconnections between health and truth and freedom. If you don't have freedom, we don't get truth. If you don't have truth, you don't get health. And if you don't have health, you're not strong enough to fight for freedom. That's what the movement is about. But thank you, Derrick. Thank you for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dr. Shiva. Thank you guys for listening. This is Derrick Broze of the Conscious Resistance Network. As always, you are powerful, you are beautiful, and you are free. Peace.
That's great.